بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد السادات سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. We're looking at the sections on commercial transactions or material transactions from Mukhtasar al-Quduri of the great Imam al-Quduri, also known as Al-Kitab. And this section on the fiqh of transactions is very significant because all other transactions are based on the principles of Aqdul Bay', which is on the sales transaction. Right? The core principles of there being two transacting parties, an offer and acceptance. What is a contract? The conditions in a contract, the need for definition, etc. These apply to all other types of transactions. And this is very significant. That's why Shaykh Mustafa Zarqa, in an important work of his called Aqdul Bay', the sales transaction, says that the Aqdul Bay', the sales contract is Ummul Uqud, the foundational contract. Right? It is the foundational contract, and that calls us to pay attention to this contract and its details. Necessarily, a matan that we're starting with is giving us the core rulings without a lot of the details, but we see important insights into how commercial transactions work. So we saw the issue of if someone buys a tree, buys the fruit of a tree. And these are applications of those foundational principles. Okay. Once, if Hamza buys 100 kilos of apples, right, or the apples on these two trees from Zain, who owns the apples now as soon as the transaction takes place? Hamza bought the apples. Hamza owns the apples. But the tree is yours. So in of itself, do you have a right to be using his tree to keep your fruit till it grows ripe? No. Because you cannot use his property without his permission. Now if he lets you, he just says, yeah, sure, leave it, come back tomorrow, come back next week, that's fine. But can you demand that from him? That's where the ishkal came of the last issue that we saw. Right? Because things like that could lead to dispute. And this is safqatani fi safqa. These is two contracts in one, which the Prophet ﷺ cautioned against. But these are not intrinsically impermissible. Historically, the ulama preferred simplicity in contracts and to keep separate agreements separate. Right? To keep separate agreements separate. And Shaykh Ali Haidar, in his commentary on the Majalla in one place, mentions one of the simple things is to have some things agreed on outside the contract. So they're not contractual agreements, they're mu'ahada. They just add as a promise. And that sort of avoids a lot of problems. Anyways, but we saw, just very briefly, that conditions in a very simple way are of three types. What are they? شرط يقتضيه العقد, right? وهو من لوازمه, a condition that's entailed by the contract, and that confirms it. Those conditions are good to mention because they just make things clear, right? Like you say, including the keys and this and this and this, and not including this, this and this, just to clarify the term, what enters and what doesn't, for example. And we're talking about relevant conditions, right? But then there are conditions not entailed by the contract and do not confirm its details. Such as, what's entailed by the contract of buying fruit is that the fruit belongs to you, take it. So, to stipulate things that are not entailed by the contract itself, and either party benefits from that stipulation, in itself, this is problematic. This would corrupt the contract because it could lead to dispute. There's an exception. What's the exception? Unless the custom is to have such a transaction, number one. Number two, that such a transaction such an agreement is a urf thabit. It's an established norm. So it's widespread and known, number one. Number two, it does not lead to dispute. Number three, it does not go against anything within the Sharia, right? There's nothing within the Sharia going against the stipulation of such a condition. So if people transact with ribawi, with riba conditions, that would not permit those conditions, for example. Okay. Now, then we stopped at Imam Quduri saying ولا يجوز بيع ثمرة أن يبيع ثمرة ويستثني منها أرطالا معلومة. Correct? So Imam Quduri rahimahullah says ولا يجوز أن يبيع ثمرة. Right? One cannot sell some fruit. And we said ثمرة is produce. Right? Is that which comes forth from a shajar. Right? So the produce, right? And to exclude from it a known number of units. So this is one of two riwayas from Imam Abu Hanifa, right? Right? So this is mentioned in several of the mutun. This is mentioned in Quduri. This is mentioned in the Mukhtasar. Right? This is also mentioned by both Burhan al-Sharia and Sadr al-Sharia. And the argument being, and this represents a narration from Imam Abu Hanifa. Right? And sometimes there's difference of opinion on what is Zahir al-Riwayah, which is sort of this modern thing. So the Imams of our madhab sometimes differed on what is Zahir al-Riwayah, because identifying Zahir al-Riwayah is not always so straightforward. There's many considerations in it. So the idea that just because now we have a bunch of books, we can, go back to the pure authentic madhab. Just look at the books that the great Imams relied upon in writing, and you'll realize they had access to both, not just the late books, but also the early books. So this is wishful thinking. Now, besides that, the argument on this riwayah is that what's left over is unknown. So I say, I'll sell you what's on these trees except for 20 kilos. Right? Now, يجوز أن يبيع ولا يجوز أن يبيع ثمرة ويستثني منها أرطالا معلومة. It's not permitted to sell some fruit, some produce, and to exclude a specific amount of kilos. Right? So the produce is specified by pointing, or it's in a box. Right? I'll sell you this except for 3 kilos. Why? Because what's left over would then not be known. And there's a reasonable possibility that we might disagree. Why? Because not everyone necessarily knows about weights and measures and so on. If you take out 3 kilos, it doesn't seem like a lot. But 3 kilos of beans, that's like 7 pounds of beans, that's a lot of beans. Right? I didn't agree to that. That leads to dispute, right? And anything that could lead to dispute affects the contract. However, النسفي in the Kanz and Sahib al-Hidayah disagreed, right? Right? So the author of the Hidayah, so Sahib al-Lubab says, that هذه رواية الحسن. What is mentioned in Quduri and the Mukhtasar and some of these other works is the narration of Imam al-Hasan. Who's Imam al-Hasan? Hasan bin Ziyad al-Lu'lu'i. وهو قول الطحاوي. It is also the position taken by Imam al-Tahawi. Now, Imam al-Tahawi is a great early Imam of the Hanafi madhab, but he is a very independent. He was at one of the, like a tertiary level of ijtihad. So he has many personal choices, which he has a right to have, but they're not necessarily representative of the madhab. So he's a great scholar, but his stances are frequently not representative of what is the transmission of the madhab. So he said this is the narration of Al-Hasan. وَأَمَّا عَلَى ظَاهِرِ الرِّوَايَةِ. As for ظاهر الرواية, the main transmission from Imam Abu Hanifa, فَيَنْبَغِي أَنْ يَجُوز. It should be permissible. Right? Because ظاهر الرواية is not always mentioned explicitly. Right? فَيَنْبَغِي أَنْ يَجُوز. However, according to ظاهر الرواية, this should be permissible. Why? What's the issue? That I'll buy the fruit on this tree except for 10 kilos. Why? لأن الأصل أي الأصل المستخرج من ظاهر الرواية. The أصل that is understood from ظاهر الرواية أن ما يجوز إيراد العقد عليه بانفراده يجوز استثناؤه من العقد. That anything that you can make the subject of a contract, you can accept it from a contract. So they say ما جاز بيعه جاز استثناؤه. Right? That's sort of a briefer way that some of the ulama refer to this. Right? ما جاز بيعه ما جاز بيعه جاز استثناؤه. Okay. Right? So that anything that is permitted to make the subject of the transaction on its own is permitted. يجوز استثناؤه من العقد. You can exclude from a contract. So can you sell 10 kilos of apples? Yes, then you could exclude them from the sale of apples. وبيع قفيز من صبرة جائز فكذا استثناؤه. Right? Right? And this is quoted from the Tasheeh, which is by Allama Qasim. Right? And this, what is mentioned here, Ibn Abidin says, huwa sahih. Right? And then the author of the Lubab quotes, قال في الفتح وعدم الجواز أقيس بمذهب الإمام. The author of the Fath says that it shouldn't be permissible according to, it is closer to the qiyas of the position of the Imam. Why? Because according to Imam Abu Hanifa, because there's two conflicting principles here, right? At one level, Imam Abu Hanifa is very careful about anything that could affect wasf al-taradi, that could affect both parties being in agreement with the transaction, corrupts the sale. إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم. Can we be sure that you'd be fine with the leftover number of apples if we excluded 10 kilos? Can you visualize right now how much 10 kilos of apples is? Can you visualize 10 kilos of apples? So you bought the apples on this tree. They look like a lot. But do you know what 10 kilos look like? A lot of people don't. Do you? Do you? Right? So how do you know you'll be fine with it? Right? So that's aqyas biqawl al-imam from that perspective. It's called, right? That idea of tahqiq wasf al-taradi, and there's many derivative furu' from that principle. However, there's a conflicting thing, which is that it's understood that if you can mention something in a contract, you can exclude it from it. As long as it does not put, as long as it's not likely to lead to dispute. Right? So, Ibn Abdin says, هو الصحيح وأجاب عما في الفتح في النهر. So, the author of Fath al-Qadir argues why it would not be, should not be permissible. Right? But Ibn Abdin disagrees and says that the arguments of Fath al-Qadir were responded to by the author of An-Nahr al-Fa'iq, Sharh Kanz al-Daqaiq. So, this other opinion, so this is so what's mentioned, that there are two opinions. What's in the matan here is a narration of Al-Hasan, but according to Zahir Riwayah, it should be permissible. Right? So, what it says, huwa sahih, that is the sahih. And then what comes after from the Fath, that was not accepted by the scholars after, like the author of the Nahr and Ibn Abdin. So, in summary, majaza bay'uhu jaza istithna'uhu. Something you can buy on its own, you can exclude from a contract. Right? So you're trying to sell some amazing ice cream. You got 5 tubs of some fancy organic Happy Cow ice cream from somewhere in rural Ontario. So you sold 4 of the tubs. Last tub, you're like, oh my God, I sold all of them. But you're making good money on them. So they say, I sell you this tub of ice cream except for 2 scoops. Would it be valid? Yes, because that which you can sell on its own, you can exclude from a contract. Right? The only time the ulama said the other position would arise would be if you say, I'll sell you this tub of ice cream except for 15 scoops. Do you and I know whether there are 15 scoops in the tub of ice cream? No? Then that's where it would put it in question. Right? If both of them would have doubt, if one or both of them would have doubt, then there'd be anything left. But that's a separate issue. So, the next issue, ويجوز بيع الحنطة في سنبلها والباقلاء في قشرها. Right? It is permitted to sell wheat in its, what's the head of the wheat called? In its ear, the sunbul, in its ear. وَالْبَاقِلَّاء فِي قِشْرِهَا. And baqilla, what is baqilla? And beans in their shell. There's a problem with selling wheat. Right? You want to get whole bushels of wheat after it's harvested. What are you actually buying? You're buying the actual grains of wheat, but they're inside. Have you seen them? No. Like the beans that are inside what are they called? The pod. Okay, he's our official fruit and vegetable department, right? Department of Agrarian Matters, right? So the bean pod. Do you know what's inside the bean pod for sure? What if it's empty? Right? Same with rice, right? The rice comes in a husk and stuff. When you buy in bulk, you buy the whole thing, right? Likewise with simsim, sesame, right? Now, ruz, of course, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, at least five or six ways you can say ruz. You can say aruz, or urz, or aruz. Right? There's 6. If you look in Qamus al-Muhit, you can say ruz, or aruz, or aruz, and many combinations. And the same thing because this is because these things, there's a problem, right? The actual thing that you're buying, you can't see. So how can you buy that which you cannot see? So you don't actually know how it is. And a lot of other things, the same issue would apply. When you're buying the watermelon, what are you actually buying? You're buying what's inside. But when you buy it, can you see it? What about the egg? Are you buying the shell? Right? So if there's a aib in it, like you bought the egg and there's nothing there, right? Then you could get a refund, right? So that would be aib. So these things that are normal, that are hidden like this, you're allowed to sell. One, because most of these are sold in large numbers. So even if, and there's a section in the Majalla that summarizes this, that, so let's say in bean pods, you typically buy one bean pod? No, right? So in one bean pod, it's possible that this one only had one bean. It'll cause some arguments between us. But you buy it in large amounts. So even if one or two are deficient, that's customarily accepted. If it's more than what's customarily accepted, it would be considered aib. Right? It would be considered a blemish and you could get a refund. Or, as we'll see with khiyar al-aib. Right? And the same thing applies in all of these. The wheat, the beans, the rice, the sesame. And actually, same thing would apply with eggs or watermelons, things that you don't actually see. Okay. And then he says, وَمَنْ بَاعَ دَارًا دَخَلَ فِي الْبَيْعِ مَفَاتِيحُ أَغْلَاقِهَا. Whoever sells a house, the the keys to its locks are considered to enter, right? Because they're considered a part of the house, and you cannot benefit to it, benefit from the house without the keys, right? Um, in the old days, money had to be weighed and checked that this is actual gold, etc. So the Imam Al-Quduri says, وأجرة الكيال وناقد الثمن على البائع. The fees, right, for the one who who measures, like the kayal who checks the volume of something, like in wheat. Wheat would be sold in volumes. Or the wazan, the one who weighs things sold by weight. Wal addad, or the one who counts. And counting would be tricky. Try counting 1,000 sheep. How do you keep track of them? You got to have a system, right? Because they don't stand still, right? Or to, so all of these, in a sale, who has to measure it? Who has to pay for the measuring? Especially in large quantities. This is, he says, وَنَاقِدِ الثَّمَنِ, right? And the ناقد الثمن, right? What is نقد الثمن? A تمييز جيده عن رديه, is to distinguish between, sound currency from fake currency. It would be a big deal in the old days with precious metals, with gold and silver, etc. You have to check that this is actually gold. So he says this is على البائع, right? And if we go down in the commentary, says وفي التصحيح قال في المحيط وأجرة الناقد ووزن الثمن على المشتري وهو الصحيح, right? Right? So the relied upon position is the cost of verifying the currency would be upon the seller, because that which relates ما تعلق بتسليم المبيع يكون على البائع. The costs entailed by delivering the item itself, so making sure it's the right number, are upon the بائع, the seller, and the things that have to do من أداء الثمن ما كان من تمام أداء الثمن فهو على المشتري, that is upon the seller, right? They said unless إلا إن تعورف خلافه, unless the urf is to the contrary of this, right? The market practice somewhere is contrary to this, أو اشترطا خلافه, or they agreed to other than this, right? So let's say Sidi Hamza had become a very accomplished shepherd, and somehow, because he found a special diet online, that if you feed the sheep this diet, they're going to have a lot of kids really fast. So he ended up with 2,000 sheep. Problem is, then he couldn't dedicate any time to study and even less time to ibadah. So he wants to sell off all his sheep. He says, okay, I'll sell you these sheep for $25,000, but on condition that you got to count them. Or you say, I sell you these sheep, they're all in a defined place, every sheep for $250, on condition that you count them, and I'll take your word for it. Can you stipulate that? Yeah. The default will be that you need to count the sheep yourself, but you don't want to. Why? Because finally I want to dedicate some time to ibadah. So he wants to go away That's up to you. وأجرة وزان الثمن على المشتري. The price for the one who weighs the cost of the one who weighs the price, because gold and silver has weight value, is upon the seller. Right? Okay. Now, what if a sales takes place? Who has to give it first? So I sell this pen for $10 to Zayn. Then he said, "Can I have the pen?" I said, "No. Give me the money first." He said, "No, give me the pen." I said, "No, give me the money." So who has to give first? Right? Because let's say two people don't trust each other. They're in the middle of the marketplace. Right? On a train platform. One train's going east, the other train's going west. Standing on the platform, and the doors are open for the trains. And they're going in a transaction. I'll sell you my watch for $5,000. Give me the watch. No, give me the $5,000. So he said, وَمَنْ بَاعَ سِلْعَةً بِثَمَنٍ قِيلَ لِلْمُشْتَرِ ادْفَعِ الثَّمَنَ أَوَّلًا. Whoever buys a commodity, a sil'a, right? That's present, بثمن, for a price that is hal, that is due now. قِيلَ لِلْمُشْتَرِ. They say this is على تقدير الخلاف. If they differ, there's not some requirement. This is على تقدير الخلاف. If they differ. قِيلَ لِلْمُشْتَرِ. It is said to the buyer, ادفع الثمن أولا. Give the price first. Right? Because the commentator says لأن حق المشتري تعين في المبيع. Because when we make the contract, you are owed that specific item of sale that was agreed upon. Right? But even if I said I'll let's say Zayn says I buy that pen from you for these $10. And then he sees, these $10, my Shaykh Faisal gave them to me, I don't want to use them. And he gives me two $5. Can I protest and no, I want those $10? No. They say, الثمن لا يتعين بالتعيين. The price is not specified by its specification, because the price is only a means. Right? So if Zayn and I disagree, said, no, Sheikh Yusuf, I want the $10 in his pocket. He says, I bought it, I'm going to pay with these two $5. I don't have a right to demand the $10. He said, I'll pay you with these $10. Right? Because الثمن لا يتعين بالتعيين. But on the other hand, if I said, I sell you this pen for $10 and I bring out its equivalent, that's not acceptable. If I wanted this pen, right? وقيل للبائع فإذا دفع فإذا دفع أي المشتري, if the buyer gives the price, قيل للبائع سلم المبيع, then it is said to the seller, give the merchandise. This if they differ. ومن باع سلعة بسلعة, if someone sells a commodity for another commodity, I sell you this pen for your kufi, your cap, or your hijab, or whatever. أو ثمنا بثمن, or we exchange two currencies, one for another. قيل لهما سلما معا. It is said to them that give at the same time. If this is all, if they differ, right? If they were to differ. Any questions? Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Then we reached khiyaru shart. Right? A khiyar in general means choice, right? But what's meant by khiyar here is the 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 choice to annul the contract, right? The option to annul the contract. So خيار الشرط, this is من إضافة الحكم إلى سببه. خيار الشرط is خيار سببه الشرط, right? It's an option to cancel arising by contractual stipulation, right? So a khiyar is that which allows you the option to cancel, right? Or similar, right? It gives you an option, which is either to cancel or to demand something, as we will see in a bit, right? And khiyar is from ikhtiyar, to have a choice, right? Right? Now, khiyar al-shart is an option to cancel, right? It is only established if specified in the contract, right? Because Ibn Abdin says in the Hashiyah, الأصل في العقد اللزوم من الطرفين. The basis of a contract is that it's binding on both parties. ولا يثبت لأحدهما اختيار الإمضاء أو الفسخ ولو في مجلس العقد عندنا إلا باشتراط ذلك, right? And neither party has the right to choose whether to go through with it or cancel, even in the majlis where the contract took place, إلا باشتراط ذلك, unless they specified it. So in our madhab, a contract once made is binding, and neither party has the right to choose whether to go through with it or to cancel it, even in the majlis, إلا باشتراط ذلك. This is in Hashiyah, page, volume 4, page 45. Right? So this is the background. The hikmat al-tashri' of khiyar al-shart, the option of cancellation, is that someone may want something and may fear losing out on something. It's a good price, seems like a good opportunity. However, they need a little more time to think about it or to consider it. Right? So for the buyer, it's obvious, right? So let's say I started selling these fountain pens. I have one left. Sidi Zain really likes the idea of a fountain pen, but recently married, he wants to get approval, etc. Doesn't want to get in trouble for spending too much, etc. But he doesn't want to miss out because he kind of likes the idea of these fountain pens. So he says, look, I'd like to buy this fountain pen. How much is the fountain pen? $10. Last one. So he said, okay. He says, I'll buy it from you if you could give me the option to cancel by tomorrow. So you can secure selling the pen, you're buying the pen, but you go home, you're like, more stuff you're buying? Like, come on. Budgets, I said, don't worry. Shaykh Faraz is not. You text, cancelled. Right? Right? It could also apply from the seller's perspective. Right? Sheikh Yusuf's been talking about buying this pen from me for ages. He said, yes, see, just keep it handy for me. I'll come. But he didn't come for day after day. Now, if he does come, I'd like to sell it to him. I say, okay, so I sell it to you, but I have the khiyar for 2 days. If by end of Friday he comes to me, then I can exercise my right to cancel it, so I can fulfill my promise to the other party. But I don't want to be in a situation where he doesn't buy it from me, and you don't buy it. I lose a customer, and then I have a pen that doesn't sell, right? So there's a hikmah for both parties, for it to be specified for the ba'i', the seller, and also for the buyer. Or it could be specified for both. And we'll see what happens. Who owns the item if there is a khiyar, if there's an option of cancellation? Does ownership transfer yet? Right, so we'll see that in a moment. So that's the basic idea of the khiyar al-shart and why it's useful. Right? Imam Al-Quduri rahimahullah ta'ala says, وَخِيَارُ الشَّرْطِ جَائِزٌ فِي الْبَيْعِ. Right? The option of cancellation is valid in a transaction. Right? And the khiyar al-shart says, جائز, the commentator says, في صلب العقد, within the contract itself. Right? أو بعده, or after. Right? So Zubayr bought the pen from me for $10. He's walking away. He says, oh, he remembers Zubaydah. So he says, see, Faraz, could I have the option of canceling for 2 days? He said, let's agree to that. He says, agreed. So that afterwards, you can agree to terms after, and they amend the contract. If there's minor terms, a verbal agreement's fine. Any terms of significance should be done in writing. In our times, the practical thing is, even if you're in a rush, just send a message. Send a text message. This text is to confirm that we've agreed to make the sale, to make the sale of the pen with an option of cancelling for 2 days. So at least you have some written record. And their brother says, I agree. So you have a written record. You don't have to turn it into a formal contract. But even on small things, just to keep some record, that's a useful thing. Send an email. It's slightly better than a text message, but it gives something that we've come to an agreement. So if someone forgets, you can say, look, we'd agreed to this. Anyways. But agreeing to something, this is important. أما قبله فلا يثبت. As for agreeing to something beforehand, but it's not mentioned in the contract, it does not count. And this is one of the really messy things with transactions. So there's a Maulana Bilal, he works in real estate. But he buys the houses himself and then he sells them. So Maulana Bilal has this house that he's selling at a discount. So they agree. There's this beautiful divider. So he says, I'd really like to take that. He says, sure. So one of us says, sure. Right? When he sees it. But when they come to the contract, say, I sell you this house for 250K, unfurnished. Did we mention the barrier? No. Now afterwards, if you come and say, but we agreed, I said, I'd like to take it. Well, that's a sure meaning if we agree to it. I say, no, something agreed to beforehand does not necessarily, so that's one of the tricky areas. Does it count as a promise? Right? Is that promise binding? That gets very messy. Right? فَتَبَيَّنُوا. Right? Make things clear. Right? Clarity in transactions is very important. So just as it applies to the khiyar al-shart, أما قبله أي قبل العقد. The Lubab mentions, quoting التتار خانية. Because the Tatar destroyed the Muslim world, but then they became Muslim. And the Fatawa Tatar Khaniya were dedicated to, or it's very interesting dedication, right? Because they became great patrons of the Islamic sciences. Anyways, that's a separate matter. So, khiyar al-shart, the option of cancelling, is permitted fil bay' in a transaction, lil bay', whether for the seller, أو والمشتري, or for the seller or the buyer, ولهما, and both of them. And it can be in all this transaction or in part of it. So if you bought the iPad and its pencil and the case, but you're not sure whether you like this case or not, right? So if we put the price separately, it says, and the case is $50, then we say, okay, on condition that I have the option to cancel on the case within the next 2 days. You can do that. So it says, في المبيع أي في المبيع كله أو بعضه. In the item of sale, in all of it, you bought 100 fountain pens. You're not sure if you need 100 or 80. You forgot what your manager asked for. You're already in trouble with the manager, because the manager, every time you pray, their manager catches you praying. But you keep forgetting numbers too. So was it 80 pens that he wanted or 100? So what do? You buy 100, it says, on condition that I have the option of cancelling on 20 of them. You can exercise that option. Right? Now, the khiyar is something that is established contrary to the basis of a sales transaction. What is the basis of a sales transaction? It's binding. When a sale takes place, there's transfer of ownership. Or there should be transfer of ownership. We'll see what happens to ownership when there is a khiyar, when there's an option of cancelling. So why did we affirm the option of cancellation? Because it's textually established from hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? The Sahabi who would keep getting tricked in his sales, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed him to to transact. He was a simple kind of person. To specify that you have the right of cancellation for 3 days. Right? So what's textually established about the period of the option of cancellation is 3 days. Right? So هذا ثابت على خلاف الأصل. The asl is a transaction's binding. An exception is made for khiyar al-shart. There's various rational when we say rational meanings deriving from Shari'i principles of prevention of harm, right? Of giving, of facilitation, this, that. There's a whole bunch of meanings that it fulfills. But this hajj, they say al-haja ila tarawi, to give time to think it through. Right? But ما ثبت لضرورة يقدر بقدرها. That which is established due to necessity is limited to the extent of the necessity. وما ثبت بنص, right? And that which is established textually يقتصر فيه على مورد النص. One limits oneself in it to what the text has come regarding. And once the text come, the prophetic exception was 3 days. So therefore, it's mentioned وَالْخِيَارُ مُدَّتُهُ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ فَمَا دُونَهَا. The option of cancellation, its max is 3 days, 3 full days, 72 hours or less. And the commentator quotes الدر المختار وفسد عند إطلاق أو تأبيد. If you make it unconditional or permanent, it would be corrupt. ولا يجوز أكثر من ذلك عند أبي حنيفة. And according to Abu Hanifa, the خيار الشرط cannot be longer than 3 days. Why? Because Imam علامة الميداني explains لأنه ثبت على خلاف القياس. Because the option of cancellation is established contrary to the qiyas, which is to the primary basis of legal reasoning, which is that the contract is binding, neither party can cancel it. فيبقى الباقي بالنص. We made an exception to that by the text. So we limit ourselves to the text. ويبقى الباقي أي ما وراء النص. And what is beyond that, beyond the text, which specified 3 days for the option of cancellation, على الأصل, which is عدم جواز الفسخ من الطرفين, which is that neither party can cancel. وقال أبو يوسف ومحمد رحمهم الله يجوز إذا سمى مدة معلومة. Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, may Allah have mercy on both of them, said it is valid to specify longer than 3 days if they specify a known period of time. Because their argument is that it was legislated for the purpose of to have time to consider. And so that one is not cheated, for example. And they may be need to consider for longer than that. So they said, so in that sense, it's similar to deferring the price. Right? Now, pretty much all the imams of tasheeh in our madhab had given the fatwa as being upon the position of Imam Abu Hanifa. Content? No. Right. Even if you look in Hashid ibn Abdin, this is what's mentioned as being the mu'tamad of the madhab. However, in Majalla item number 300, right? And you can there's 2 photos we can take from here. You can write it down. He says, the authors of the Majalla, radiyallahu ta'ala anhum, they said, يجوز أن يشترط الخيار بفسخ البيع أو إجازته مدة معلومة. It is permitted to specify the option to cancel the sale or to make it binding for any defined period. Allama Khalid al-Atasi rahimahullah ta'ala in his commentary volume 2, page 234. He mentions that this is وهذا اختيار من المجلة لقول الصاحب الإمامين. The Majalla here has chosen the position of the two Imams, and he explains why, etc., 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 etc. And that, but that was taken. والفتوى في زماننا على قول الصاحبين. And the fatwa in our times is in the position of the Sahibin. Because sometimes there's a need for it. You make a really big transaction, but you need to wait till you get approval from your manager. You need to do some testing. It could take time on really large orders, right? So let's say, Sheikh Yusuf has a friend in Singapore who buys and sells plastic chairs. And there's a big chain of restaurants that that ordered 3,000 fuchsia colored plastic chairs. But 3,000 fuchsia chairs, they need someone to test all of them, because it's like a fancy brand. So he buys the chair, his friend buys the chairs to resell them to this big chain, but he wants the option of canceling in case it's not quite the right thing. So it might take him several days to go through 3,000 chairs, etc. So here the fatwa is on the position of why? Of the urf. Because it's become custom. Now we have to be very clear. This is not a refund policy. The option of cancellation, and we'll see why. Because an option of cancellation, the one who has the option of cancellation, what from their side does not leave their property legally. Right? So they don't own it yet. Right? So and there's implications for it that are explained. So it makes the sale is binding, but its completion is suspended. Because the ownership does not fully transfer when there's a khiyar shart. And we'll see what happens. Right? And you cannot use the item. Because the whole purpose of the option of cancellation is you're still considering whether you want to go through with it or not. The only thing you can do is to test the item of sale. Anything that indicates that you're content with your side of the sale, so for the buyer, the mushtari, if they start using the item of sale, the option is gone. So that's completely different from a refund policy. Because a refund policy, you can use it, etc., and give it back. Right? So this is the option of cancellation is you consider it, you don't like it, you give it back. The only usage that is permitted is على وجه الاختبار, just for testing. Right? So we'll see that. So he says وخيار البائع يمنع خروج المبيع من ملكه. So and this would be good to diagram. So the option, there's two basic cases. The option of cancellation is with the seller. If the seller has the option of cancellation, it prevents the item of sale from leaving his property. So, because I want the option to cancel. So things like this, it's best to give an example. In your own notes too. Let's say I sell, so Zain, if you would get up, right? So let's say, I sell this pen to Zain for $10, on condition that I have the option to cancel for the next 23 minutes. You accept, okay? So now he has the pen. Who does the pen belong to though? It still belongs to me. Why? Because I wanted the option to cancel the transaction. So it's an amana in his hand. He doesn't own it yet. So if I have the option of cancellation, therefore, and why is this? Because I want the option to cancel. If he owned it, what could he do with it? Forget using it. You could sell it off. But then how would I cancel it? Right? So I want my pen back. So I no longer owe you $10. Okay? So خيار البائع يمنع خروج المبيع من ملكه. The option of cancellation, if it belongs to the seller, it prevents the item of sale, the mabir, from leaving his property. Even if the other person takes it, right? فإن قبضه المشتري. So the mushtari, the buyer, he has it as an amana. Right? And as one of the brothers said, it's an amana, not a banana. Right? Like, you're like, take care of it, don't just use it up, right? So it becomes فإن قبضه المشتري فهلك في يده ضمنه القيمة. Right? So let's step back a second. So if I sell this pen and I have the option of canceling, I am the ba'i'. This is the mabir, the item of sale. I sell it for $10 with the option of cancellation for the next 30 minutes or next 3 days. I own it. How does the buyer, the mushtari, they have it as an amana, as a trust. It's in their safekeeping. It's in their safekeeping. So فهلك في يده ضمنه القيمة. So فإن قبضه المشتري, if the buyer, the mushtari, takes possession of it and it perishes in his hand within the time of the khiyar, what does the mushtari owe? Al-qima. Now here, there's an important distinction. Right? There's a distinction between the qima and the thaman. And these are defined in the Majalla, but also you can find it Hashia, volume 4, page 52. Right? The thaman is ما تراضى عليه العاقدان. The thaman is the agreed upon price. So let's say, Sheikh Yusuf, I sell you this pen for $155.22. He accepts. So what's the thaman here? $155.22 or 23 cents, whatever we agreed upon, right? That's the thaman. ما تراضى عليه العاقدان. What the two parties agreed to. The qima, that's the agreed upon price. The qima is ما يقوم به الشيء. Right? عند التجار. Right? So Ibn Abdi says فهو بمنزلة المعيار. Right? It's like a standard. It's a market price. Right? The qima is the market price. Now, if we're smart, and like, there's, what's it called? There's, we know what the market price is, etc. The assumption would be, yarhamukumullah, that we're buying and selling it at or around the market price, but not necessarily. So Zubayr comes, says, Zubaydah loves this pen. She really wants to buy it. I'm not selling, it's my pen. So I insist. So I don't want to sell it. I'll pay you $100. I don't want to sell it. $150. I don't want to sell it. $155, 23 cents. That's all I have, Shaykh. Okay. But the market price of this pen is $20. Or whatever it is. I forget how much it is. But let's say it's $20. So let's say I sold this pen to Sheikh Yusuf for $155, 23 cents. I had the option of canceling for the next 24 hours. So he takes it. And he opens the pen and accidentally breaks it. What does he owe me? Right? He owes me, because it was an amana in his hand, because I had the option of canceling. So the ownership did not transfer over. So the price is not due. The agreed upon price is not due. The qima is due. The market value. Because his hand, was not yadu milkin, it was yadu amana. His hand, he had it in his possession, not out of ownership, but as an amana, because it still belongs to me. So what's due is the qima, which is the market price, right? So this distinction between the market price, the qima, and the thaman is important to be clear about. So you can find that in Ibn Abdin says, الفرق بين القيمة والثمن أن الثمن ما تراضى عليه العاقدان. Alhamdulillah. The thaman is what the two transacting parties agreed upon. This is the mutual agreed upon price. سواء زاد على القيمة أو نقص, whether more than the market price or less. والقيمة ما قوم به الشيء. The qima, the market price, is the market valuation of a thing. And they say ما يقوم به شيء يعني عند التجار, according to traders. بمنزلة المعيار. It's like a standard. Right? You can find it Hashia, volume 4, page 52. Anyways. So this is, and diagram this, like case 1, al-khiyaru lil-ba'i'. What happens? The mabi' does not leave his property. So the yad of the mushtari, the hand of the buyer, is a yadu amana, la yadu milk. Okay. So daminahu al-qima. Daman is what is the compensation, right? We have to compensate with the qima. وَخِيَارُ الْمُشْتَرِي. What if the buyer had the option of cancelling? وخيار المشتري لا يمنع خروج المبيع من ملك البائع. Right? The option of cancellation on part of the mushtari, the seller, does not prevent the item of sale leaving the ownership of the ba'i', of the seller. So it's no longer. So I sell this pen to Sheikh Yusuf for $50. But he has to make sure Minister of Interior does not object. So therefore he has the option of cancelling for a day. So the buyer, the mushtari, has the option of cancelling. It leaves my property. I don't have an option in this. So it leaves my property. Right? But Imam Abu Hanifa said, إلا أن المشتري لا يملكه عند أبي حنيفة. But the buyer does not own it according to Abu Hanifa. وقالا يملكه. But the Sahibain said, you own it. Right? فإن هلك في يده. Right? So in this case, according to Abu Hanifa, right? إن هلك في يده. If the mushtari, if the buyer has the option of cancellation, it leaves my property, but it does not enter yours. Right? فإن هلك في يده في يد المشتري. If it perishes in his hand, هلك بالثمن. You owe the agreed upon price, not the market price, the agreed upon price. Because then it's as if your option of cancellation is terminated, so it ruined in his own hands, so he has to pay the agreed upon price. وكذلك إذا دخله عيب لازم. Likewise, it applies if a عيب, a blemish, a defect, if a defect and affects it. Right? So what is the consequence of the khiyar al-shart? He explains, وَمَنْ شُرِطَ لَهُ الْخِيَارِ فَلَهُ أَنْ يَفْسَخَ فِي مُدَّةِ الْخِيَارِ وَلَهُ أَنْ يُجِيزَهُ. Whoever has the option of cancellation, the al-khiyar, a khiyar al-shart, فَلَهُ أَنْ يَفْسَخَ فِي مُدَّةِ الْخِيَارِ, they have the right to cancel the contract within the period of the option. وَلَهُ أَنْ يُجِيزَهُ, or one can choose to make the sale, the transaction binding. Because that's the purpose of the option of cancellation. فَإِنْ أَجَازَ بِغَيْرِ حَضْرَةِ صَاحِبِهِ جَازَ. If one makes the transaction binding in بغير حضرة صاحبه, away from the presence of the other party, it is valid. Right? And بغير حضرة, without the other party being present. In the tanweer, he changed the expression here, says مع جهل صاحبه, without the other party knowing. Right? So let's say Shaykh Yusuf bought this pen and said, I have the right to cancel for a day. So you have the right to cancel. So you said, no, I'm keeping it. You said it to yourself. You didn't tell me anything, but you had the option of canceling. You don't have to tell me, although it's better to tell me right away, but you decide to keep it. This is, so حضرة صاحبه, meaning مع جهل صاحبه. بغير حضرة صاحبه أي مع جهل صاحبه. جاز. وإن فسخ, but if you cancel, لم يجوز إلا أن يكون الآخر حاضرا. Right? But if you cancel the contract, it is required that the other person be present. And in the commentator says, وَشَرْطِ الْعِلْمِ. Right? That the condition is that the other party know about it. يعني لا الحضور الحقيقي. Right? حاضرا. So this expression is a bit broad. Right? That you cannot cancel it without the other party being informed. Right? Because if Shaykh Yusuf bought this pen for $10 on condition that he has the right to cancel for a day, and he canceled tonight, then it comes back to being my property. And I have the right to then seek to sell it to somebody else. So me not being informed would entail being harmed. Right? وإن فسخ لم يجوز إلا أن يكون الآخر حاضرا أي عالما به. Right? And then he says, وَإِذَا مَاتَ مَنْ لَهُ الْخِيَارِ بَطَلَ خِيَارُهُ. If the one who has the option of cancellation dies, their option of cancellation ends. Because the option of cancellation is just a judgment. Just a personal opinion. Opinions don't transfer. As opposed to, for example, the option of cancelling if there's a defect. So Zubair and his son, Zuhair, went to the market. Zubair bought my pen for $155.23. And then he walked by another store, saw it for $20, had a heart attack, died. But he had the option of cancellation. So his son Zuhair can come to me and said, this pen used to belong to my father. He purchased from you with the option of cancelling for a day. My father has just died. I'm exercising his right of cancellation. Can he do that? Can he do that? No. Because خيار الشرط ومن مات وله خيار الشرط بطل خياره. Whoever dies and they have the option of cancelling, their option of cancellation is annulled. ولم ينتقل إلى ورثته, and it does not transfer to their inheritors. Because it's only a choice. Choices don't transfer. As opposed to a aib. Right? A aib. So I sold this pen, but turns out that the pen I sold it because I was showing different people the pen, so I took out the nib. Right? So I sold the pen just like this. So Zubair saw that the pen was being sold for $20, had a heart attack, died. I didn't cheat him. I didn't claim it was a good price or anything. I just said, if you want it, it's $155.23. Right? Father died. And they're traders. Traders can be sometimes cold-hearted. He opens his pen. Aib. So he tells the ambulance people, I'll be back in a second. He goes and says, excuse me, Brother Faraz, the pen has a aib. I have a khiyar. I have the option of al-aib. Right? Because the lack of a nib is a fundamental problem. Because you can't write without the nib. Right? So you have the option, because the aib still remains. So you have the right to exercise it. And then if you look at the commentaries, they say which rights transfer and which don't. Okay. Then he has one more issue, and this is a particular. This is a separate khiyar. This is called khiyaru fawati wasfin marghub. Right? Or something called khiyarul wasf. Or khiyaru fawati wasfin maqsood. Majalla gives some extra details for it. Right? What if you specified a particular thing that is customarily recognized as being sought? That's why some give it a long name. خيار فوات وصف مرغوب عادة. Right? Because it's not just whimsical. Right? That, okay. Like if someone says, I want to buy this dress on condition that the fuchsia color glimmers dazzlingly in the sunlight. Is that a reasonable condition? No. Right? Nobody, that's not a contractually binding thing. But he gives an example. من باع عبدا على أنه خباز أو كاتب فكان بخلاف ذلك فالمشتري بالخيار إن شاء أخذه بجميع الثمن وإن شاء ترك. Right? If someone sells a slave, على, and على is used أي بشرط. على يستعمل للشرط, on condition that they are a writer or a khabbaz, they're a baker, and they're not. Right? And who is a khabbaz? It's not just that they can bake bread, because any fool could put dough together and throw in the oven and something come out. But who's considered a baker? That in the marketplace, would they call this person a baker? أي من صح إطلاق وصف الخباز عليه ولو أدنى الوصف. Anyone you could call a baker, even if it be the least level. Have you ever baked a bread? Anything? Cake, muffin, anything? What? Have you? Okay. Have you? No. Sheikh Yusuf, save us here. I used to make parathas. I know how to make parathas. Right from the dough. Okay? Partly because my grandmother used to make them, and I got fed up because she wouldn't make them all the time. So I said, I'll learn how to do it. And partly because it had a lot of sugar. I used to eat sugary parathas. So my mother said, don't have that much sugar. What? Okay. So I just went to the kitchen, made them myself. A few disasters, learned how to make it. But I can make a paratha, but last made it long ago. Would I be called a baker? No. Like, could I go and work as a baker just because I made parathas years ago? No. Right? So, or a katib, a writer, a scribe. Not everyone who can write is a writer. Right? What is considered al-urf? What is the minimum market standard for what someone would be called? It's like in our time, you employ someone that they're an accountant. Right? That's why in the marketplace, there was actually a category of person that it was the duty of the sultan, of the rulers to appoint, which is the muhtasib. And the institution of hisbah, of public accountability, was very important. And there's different types of hisbah amongst them in the marketplace. And they would set standards. But they would also frequently, in different marketplaces, they would set standards. So the people of that industry would set standards. So the rice sellers would set a standard. What's good quality rice? Medium quality, good quality. Like in our times, you have different types of eggs. Why? Like, ever wonder why there's different types of eggs? But there's standards for it. What's a grade triple A egg? Right? Why? So if someone makes a claim, there's a standard for verifying it. It avoids disputes. Right? Like what you can call juice. What is juice? Juice is that which is considered juice. But then, because there's all kinds of false claims, people set a standard. Right? So that's why they, things that have sugar added, etc., etc. Right? So similarly, whoever buys a slave on condition that they are a baker or a writer, and it turns out that they're not, right? Such that the least of what would customarily be called writer or baker does not apply to them. فالمشتري بالخيار, the buyer has the option, if they wish, they can take them as is, or if they wish, they can cancel the transaction. They cannot demand a discount. Why? Because you took the principle. الأوصاف لا يقابلها شيء من الثمن. Right? Qualities, no aspect of the price relates to them. Right? And this is called لفوات الوصف المرغوب. Right? So a little bit is mentioned there about that. right? And in this section, I don't know when I wrote this, ages ago, I said here about the lubab, I said الشارح كثير الاعتماد على حاشية شيخه ونقل ما نقله لكنه قلما يذكر ذلك. That the commentator relies a lot on the hashia of his Shaykh, Radd al-Muhtar of Ibn Abdin, because the author Lubab's student of Ibn Abdin. And he frequently quotes what his Shaykh quotes, but he rarely mentions, because known, like he's, right? أنا من فيضي فضلي سادتي. Right? I am just an expression of the rank of my masters. Okay? Radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So that is a section on khiyar al-shart. Then we have khiyar al-ru'ya, and then khiyar al-aib. So we'll tackle those one by one. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وحزبه والحمد لله رب العالمين. No, you can ask for whatever you want, but can you demand it? Right? So let's say you purchased, and it's not a, yeah, so you cannot demand a discount. You can request anything, right? Say, look, I bought this, let's say you bought a dog on condition that they are a guard dog. And the dog's scared of even the cats that you have in your house. Anyone who walks by, the dog runs away into their little, into their shed and hides and starts squealing. So by no standard do they qualify as a guard dog. So we say, okay, what is a guard dog? What is considered a guard dog in the market? Like what's, and if it doesn't fit any of the criteria, then you have a right to a refund. But say, well, but I've grown to like fufu, so I'd like a discount. Sorry. Fufu's worth $552.29. Right? You either keep fufu as is or refund. But you cannot demand a discount. Right? You can request a discount. Oh, sorry. Fifi was the guard dog, not Fufu. So, okay, I apologize. I'll give you a $23 discount. Said $23 is not reasonable. End up negotiating. Just pay me $475.09. We agree to it. But that'd be with mutual agreement. But you don't have a right to reduce. They say you went to a dog expert and they said, well, the difference in this kind of dog between guard dog and non-guard dog is $68.03. So you say, according to this, you owe me. No. I sold you this. It being a guard dog is a wasf. You cannot demand. You cannot just take a discount on the basis of that. But you could request it, but then it's up to me whether I agree or not. Of course, just for the record, it is makruh to buy a guard dog, but to buy a dog, right? The sale is valid, but unless you have a legitimate purpose for it, it is sinful to buy. Right? It's permitted to have a guard dog, a shepherd dog. In our times, the ulama have given fatwa, it's permitted to have a blind dog, but that is not a mere pet dog, certainly indoors. If one keeps a dog outside, then that's not considered. The issue is to keep the dog in one's home. One keeps the dog outside the home, then that's not a problem.
How many days after the sale can the owner show
Sorry?
How many days after the sale can the khiyar shart be stipulated? Is there limits?
Much after. But on the premise, if you've already used it, it's already yours. Then it would become something else, which would be iqala, which would be cancellation. Because the point of the khiyar is, the sale is not complete yet. It stays partially pending. The iqala, which is cancellation, that's a separate matter. Right?
Yeah, whether I want to buy it or not, and then not without the intention of testing it, I just start using it.
Then the intention doesn't matter. It's yeah, you may immediately. So I put from, there's khiyar shart. In the Dur, in Tanwir al-Absar, so it's Hashit ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 55 to 57. In the Tanwir it says, وَتَمَّ الْعَقْدُ بِمَوْتِهِ وَمُضِيِّ الْمُدَّةِ والإعتاق وطلب الشفعة وكذا. Okay. So they say the principle is that تم العقد بكل استعمال يدل على الرضا بالملك. Right? The khiyar ends with any usage that indicates ownership, not mere اختبار, not mere testing. ولو ناسيا. That's your problem, right? Now, contractually, it would be recommended for me. So let's say you just started using it forgetfully. Then من جهة الأخلاق من أقال نادما عثرته أقال الله عثراته يوم القيامة. But that's recommended. But but I said, yeah, that's really good, but I need the $155.23 for that pen. Because I plan to go to some, the smoke, the smoked halal barbecue. It's going to cost a lot. So I need the $155. Right? That's my choice. Right? And you see in societies where people have knowledge of mu'amalat, right? Like certainly in old Damascus you would see this. I've heard a lot of descriptions of tareem, etc. and the and people would be learned in their transactions. You'd have sound transactions, but number two, you'd have the akhlaq of the tujjar, right? And there's a beautiful work by Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabhani on it's a collection of a lot of hadiths of دليل التجار إلى أخلاق الأخيار, a guide for traders to the characteristics of the virtuous, of the hadiths related to the ethics of trade and the virtues, right? And those are important values, right? There's even online on YouTube, there's a few seminars, like courses that Habib Omar and other mashayikh have done for like a multaqa tujjar, like a conference just for traders. And a lot of them seem just like simple, like just shopkeepers and stuff, right? Because to do things right. Right? And there's barakah in this, right? And a lot of people to start, there's a book, actually it was written as a book of a fiqh manual for women called Bihishti Zewar, Heavenly Ornaments. It has all the chapters on trade, because it's a very common thing. It's common sense. And with all due respect to all women folk, but you have to be a fool to get into a situation where you're fully dependent on a person who'll die, who may leave you, and who may wrong you. And if you're fully financially dependent, this is your choice. Right? Historically, people, one, saved, number two, ran businesses. right? And businesses. You invest your money. You like the example of Sayyidah Khadija, right? Not necessarily some themselves, some through agents, etc. But you have a right to preserve your best interests. And the failure to do so, there's an economic argument why people shouldn't marry, right? Because if there's a 35% chance, 40% chance that the marriage is not going to work out, and you're going to be fully dependent on somebody, and then you'll be economically plastered, how does that make sense? Right? So the fact that a lot of Muslim women aren't marrying is because we have funny conceptualizations of how marriage works, especially in the challenges of times. So people need to be aware of these rulings so they can act upon them. They can start their own business, start using their money in ways that preserve their worldly good, and the worldly good is a means to the next worldly good. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.